Andre Keller watched the artificial sun come up on his monitors first. Outside, the desert still sat in early grey. Inside the control room, every screen glowed with color bars and false color fields. On the main display, a narrow oval of bright red at the center of the reactor graphic meant the plasma stream was holding where it should. Someone had drawn a smiley face in dry erase marker on the lower corner of that display. The mouth sat right under the containment readout. Andre rubbed the tired lines beside his eyes, then checked the magnetic field values again. He'd been on shift since midnight. His brain kept trying to turn the changing numbers into a rhythm. He pushed the habit down. Patterns could soothe you. They could also lull you right past the one number that meant everything was about to go bad. The intercom crackled. Simon Wells's voice drifted up from the observation room below, soft but brisk. Field coils at nominal. Start ramping to full test. Andre's hand hovered over the power control. The slider was a physical lever, a concession to older engineers who trusted things they could feel more than screens. He glanced at the printed checklist taped to the console. Start ramp. Confirm containment stability. Confirm emergency dump path. Confirm interlock status. The emergency dump light glowed green. He eased the lever forward. Numbers climbed. Plasma temperature. Confinement efficiency. Field coil load. The central oval on the main display shifted from red toward white, a false color telling him it was hotter than anything on Earth should ever be. Someone behind him let out a low whistle. Keep chatter down. Andre kept his eyes on the data. The room behind him held maybe a dozen controllers. He knew them all by posture and breathing now. Nervous laughs, chair squeaks, the small movements people used when they wanted to look relaxed and important at the same time. He'd sat there through the dry runs, watched them hit the same marks. Nothing in his body felt different now. That should have reassured him. It didn't. A line on the containment screen twitched. Andre leaned closer. The field shape had shifted by an amount that mattered if you cared about margins instead of headlines. One side of the oval bulged, then eased back. He checked the raw numbers. Field asymmetry up by a fraction. Still technically within the acceptable band Simon had signed off on. The kind of deviation that would go in a report, but not a press release. He tapped his headset. Wells, I'm seeing some wobble on the east side coils. A pause. When Simon answered, the clipped precision in his tone said he was already tired of being questioned. We expected minor dynamics at that level. Keep going. Watch it. Andre could have pushed harder. He could have said, we can hold here, take readings, run one more model before we push to full. The script in his head, the one he'd written for himself when he took the job, told him to do exactly that. Behind him, Fielding, the program director, shifted. Andre felt the man's attention like a heat lamp. Fielding wasn't on a headset. He had no lines on the official checklist. His job was to stand near the back of the room and radiate expectation. Andre nudged the lever farther. The artificial sun, a torus of plasma caged by magnetic fields under tons of concrete and metal, drank in the extra power. The containment readout steadied. Numbers crossed thresholds they'd rehearsed. Test minimum, intermediate, design goal. Hold at test level. Maintain. Simon's voice floated up again. Andre locked the lever. Status lights across the room glowed steady. He exhaled through his teeth. His shoulders dropped half an inch. He let himself imagine the call to public affairs, the controlled photos of the bright reactor hall, the careful language about ushering in a new era. On one side of the room, a junior tech clapped once. No one stopped him. Radiation flux at optimum, another controller called. We are... The emergency dump light went dark. Andre stared at it, his brain refusing to assign meaning for a heartbeat. Then his palm hit the manual dump switch. Nothing. No clunk of heavy contactors. No shift in the field numbers. The light stayed dead. He hit the switch again, harder. Dump's not responding. Voices sharpened. Chairs rolled. A few men stood. Fielding stepped closer to his console. Glitch? Dump hardware's offline. Andre grabbed the phone handset that linked directly to the reactor floor. No dial tone. He set it down with more care than it deserved. On the screens, the colored icons that represented sensors and cameras began to go flat and grey. Not all at once. From the center outward, like ripples from a stone. Control! We're losing feeds. One of the controllers leaned toward his screens and stabbed keys that did nothing. Power glitch! Fielding's fingers knotted around the back of Andre's chair. Andre shook his head. The overhead lights still burned. Ventilation fans still hummed. The main grid was up. Whatever was failing, it was failing in a clean circle carved around the reactor itself. One camera in the corner of the main display stayed live. The oldest one. A heavy analog unit mounted behind a shielded window high in the reactor hall. It didn't care about digital buses or smart relays. It sent its signal up a fiber optic bundle older than some of the men in the room. On its grainy image, Andre saw the reactor core. The central chamber had always looked like an industrial set from an old science movie, all curving metal, thick rings of coils, armored floor. Now all of that was gone. Where the reactor vessel should have been, a column of light rose straight upward, narrow at its base and widening as it climbed, like a geyser turned vertical. It punched through the ceiling in a blur of vapor and dust. The upper layers of concrete glowed, then began to slump. Someone swore under their breath. The light wasn't a simple color. At its heart it was white, flirting with blue, too bright for the camera, blooming into a smear. Around the edges ran thinner filaments, turning slowly in bands, like wind around an eye. A maintenance drone perched on a gantry near the column tried to retreat along its track. Its motors stalled halfway. It froze, metal skin beginning to glow. One of the thin arcs from the column reached for it. The drone vanished into the glare. The camera showed only the aftermath. A lump fell out of the shining column, trailing short streaks of molten material. It hit the floor beside the central pit, bounced once, then came to rest in view. The control room fell quiet. The object was about the size of a basketball. Its surface looked like metal that had been melted and then frozen mid-motion. Ripples turned solid. One side carried a camera lens, the glass blistered but intact, set in a smooth circle. Around the sphere's equator, 4 drone rotor blades had fused into curved legs. One of those legs twitched. It curled inward, scraped against the floor, then pushed. The makeshift limb didn't bend at its designed joint. It bent where the molten metal had cooled thin. The sphere dragged itself a few inches. Another leg joined in, then another. It found a twitchy rhythm. It moved toward the column of light, leaving scorched streaks behind. Andre, Fielding's voice sounded far away. Can we shut it down? Dump path's dead. Control electronics in the hall are dead. We might still have breakers in the yard, but all their controls run through the same bus. And manual. Fielding hunched over the console, eyes locked on the screen. The manual handles are in the hall, under that. Andre watched the sphere crawl. Even if someone could get there, nothing powered will function in that radius. Every actuator would freeze. On the screen, flakes of ceiling fell through the light. Some vanished in the core and didn't reappear. Some dropped out as new shapes twisted and fused, half melted and half sharp. One chunk that had once been a safety rail slammed down near the crawling sphere. It bounced. The sphere shifted course with clumsy determination, heading now for the thicker mass of metal. The emergency alarms in the control room never sounded. They hadn't failed. Their circuits simply no longer meant anything. Someone reached past Andre and hit the building evacuation switch anyway. A bell down the hall started clanging, an old mechanical ringer driven by spring and hammer. The only part of the safety system that was purely physical. Clear the room, Fielding called. Go! Go! Chairs scraped. Footsteps thudded toward the exit. Andre stayed in his seat for 3 more breaths, watching the analog feed. The column of light widened by a fraction. bright edges licking farther toward the walls. Objects near its base showed a subtle slide toward it, as if the floor itself had tilted. The crawling sphere reached the fallen rail section. Its legs hooked over the metal, testing weight, then began to climb. Andre pushed the lever all the way to 0 out of instinct. The slider moved under his hand. The numbers on the screens didn't change. He stood, headset cord snapping tight, and tore it free. The last thing he saw before he turned was the lens on the crawling sphere turning, damaged glass seeming to catch the camera's viewpoint, like an eye noticing another eye. The image blew out to white as the old camera finally failed. Andre ran. The first thing I noticed when we hit the perimeter was the silence. Not the kind that means peace, the kind that arrives after too many things have been switched off. The diesel truck shuddered under me as it climbed the last low rise toward the tape line. The cab was a mess of gauges and improvised switches, a dashboard built from half a century of scavenging. Someone had bolted an old mechanical tachometer where the touchscreen should have been. Steel conduit replaced bundled wires. Every modern convenience was either ripped out or hung dead. Owen Jones drove, broad hands loose on the wheel. He'd shaved his head to stubble for the desert, and a faded wrench tattoo ran along one forearm. A mechanic pulled off an oil field job and dropped into a NASA contract because he understood what heavy rigs did to human bodies when they failed. I watched the horizon. The artificial sun was impossible to miss. A column of white rose from the desert, straight up into the haze. Even miles out, it looked like some giant had taken a cutting torch to the sky. It didn't flicker, it just burned. We rolled to a stop at a ragged line of wooden stakes and orange paint. Beyond that, the ground looked no different. Same scrub, same dust, clear air. If you stumbled across it with no warning, you'd never know a circle 50 miles wide had been carved out of the living grid. Owen killed the engine. The truck coughed once and settled. An aftertaste of vibration stayed in my ribs. A man in a dusty windbreaker stepped out from a plywood guard shack. Harlan Mott moved with the careful economy of someone who'd already decided how much energy his body had left to spend. His hair had gone mostly grey, cut short. Old radio headphones hung around his neck, more habit than function now. He raised a hand. "You must be West." "Caleb." I climbed down. The step creaked under my boot. "West is on the paperwork." He grunted. "Mott, comms. They yanked me off my couch for this." A tilt of his head toward the white column. "Whole career. I heard about big projects. Didn't expect them to hand me one at the end." He reached into the shack and brought out a battered handheld radio. "Watch." He thumbed it on. Static hissed. He walked toward the stakes, radio to his chest. Owen and I followed. At the line, Harlan extended his arm. As soon as the radio crossed the invisible boundary, the noise cut. No fade, just sound, then nothing. The indicator lights on the face went dark, like someone had pulled the batteries while we watched. He pulled it back. Static returned. "Dead zone." He glanced at me. 50 miles, give or take. No metallic circuit carries current in there. The field dampens high-energy current and locks it up in its game. Another quick look. "I can give you the long explanation later. You won't like it better." "I prefer the short version," I answered. "Short hurts less." He smiled without showing teeth. "Welcome to the Sunbelt." Past the stakes, the desert dipped slightly, then rolled toward the distant base structures. From here I could see clusters of prefab buildings, rail spurs, cranes. The nearer parts of the camp sat outside the line. The rails led in. A siren wound up briefly by the offices, then cut off. Probably another test. Every sound out here stood out too clearly. No power lines buzzed, no air handler murmur. Owen swung open the truck's rear door and hauled my duffel out. "You get the tour now," he said. "Fielding wants you before your boots get dusty." I thought they already were. I shouldered the bag. We walked along a grated path toward the main cluster, The sun hung low but bright. It made the white column look harsher, not softer. The column didn't care what the real sun did. Men moved around the camp in wiry lines of purpose. Some wrestled coils of steel cable, feeding them through winches bolted to heavy sleds. Others knelt by track sections, bolting them into straight runs that pointed like arrows toward the dead zone. The place felt like a forward base built in a hurry. Tents, modular units, shipping containers turned into labs, wooden boards on posts instead of screens, paper clipped to them in uneven layers. An old brass bell hung near one of the rails. A hand-lettered note under it read, "If you see something moving and it shouldn't be, ring this." Good. Someone here remembered that alarms have to outlive the systems they watch. Inside the central office block, the air shifted from dry heat to cool. No hum of climate control, but the thick walls blunted the sun. Fielding waited in the main conference room. Late 50s, the build of a man who'd lost his fight with the treadmill a decade ago and made peace with it. Thin hair, neat beard, collared shirt tucked into slacks that didn't belong in a desert. He stood when we entered. The others in the room stayed seated. Power in a small gesture. "Caleb West." He extended a hand. "Thank you for coming on short notice." I set my duffel near the door and took his hand. Firm grip, dry palm, eyes tracking every twitch in mine. "I hear your list's shorter than it used to be," I said. "Not many safety investigators left who remember how to work without power." His mouth twitched. "True enough. Sit." He nodded me toward a chair at the far side of the table. Owen slipped into a seat against the wall. Harlan took up a post near the door. Two other men sat across from Fielding. One wore a plain green uniform without rank pins, just a name tape and a patch with an eagle clutching an abstract shape. Hunt, the colonel. Short hair to regulation, expression carved in stone. A man who measured time in minutes and casualties. The other, in a wrinkled polo and jeans, bent over paper charts and photographs. Simon Wells. I recognized him from internal briefings. Chief physicist on the artificial sun project. The man who'd wanted a star in a box and gotten something else. Fielding waited until I sat. "Here's what you need now. During the final demonstration of the flux reactor, we encountered an event." He let the word hang for a beat. The field configuration collapsed into a stable pattern we didn't anticipate. Simon didn't look up from his papers. Local ionization, electron stripping, a persistent column of high-energy plasma. It established a region where conduction fails, no current flow. Energy won't travel along familiar paths inside that circle. "In plain language," I said, "you broke the grid." "In plain language, we created a dead zone. Power lines, electronics, anything that depends on metallic circuitry, dies inside a radius around the reactor. Outside that radius, the world goes on. Inside, different rules." "How stable is it?" I looked toward the narrow window. Even through thick glass and glare, the artificial sun marked the horizon like a welding arc. "Has the radius changed since the event?" "Not in any way that matters." Simon finally glanced up. His eyes were washed-out blue, ringed by bad sleep. "Variation at the edges on the order of meters. Likely superficial effects from weather and local disturbances. The core region remains the same. And the column. Also stable. Think of it as an exhaust path. Excess energy leaves there, steady flow into the upper atmosphere. The important thing," Fielding added, "is that the zone isn't expanding. We knocked towns offline. Those people are relocated. The national grid's cut and rerouted around the zone. For now, it's contained." Hunt shifted. "For now, we've got a strategic risk sitting in the desert. A target. A magnet for every journalist and foreign intel service with travel money. Washington wants to know what this thing is, what it can do, and how soon we'll stop being surprised." Fielding spread his hands. "That's where you come in. We can't use standard remote tools. Anything we send in with circuits, motors, even a modern ignition dies. We're rebuilding a field program around analog devices. Mechanical recorders, film cameras, clockwork sequences. Before we send people and gear in regularly, we need a clear assessment of risks, procedures, safeguards. In other words, I said, you want to know what you can get away with before you start sending men in every day. Fielding held my gaze. We want to know how to operate safely in an environment no one's ever seen. Owen coughed near the wall, a half-swallowed laugh. I turned to Simon. And the other thing? He frowned. What other thing? I saw the preliminary incident photos, the ones your team tried not to label. You didn't just get a column of light and a blackout. You got something coming out of it. Constructs. Simon's nostrils flared. His eyes dropped to the charts. Material ejection with strange bonding, melted scrap, artifacts of a runaway field configuration. That scrap walked. I leaned back. There was a drone near the core. A piece of it came back out fused into a new shape and moved across the floor under its own power. Fielding's smile thinned. We'll show you the footage. Hunt steepled his fingers. Whatever this phenomenon's doing, it reshapes matter and energy. That's why we can't just pour concrete over it and pretend it never happened. We have a once-in-a-century material science opportunity. Maybe more. Our job is to keep it from hurting anyone we don't want it to hurt. I thought about that we, how it spread ownership around the table, including me before I'd even signed a badge. Any deaths so far? Initial event casualties. Facility staff, technicians. We evacuated the site and the surrounding towns. Since then, all fatalities are from the event itself. None in this phase. We intend to keep it that way. I knew how many times I'd heard intend in my career. On rigs, in boardrooms, on calls where executives stressed that safety was a priority minutes before cutting the training budget. Intent lasted until someone needed a shortcut. You'll go in with Mott and Jones, Fielding went on. First priority is recovering any mechanical data recorders near the core. We believe some of the old chart units stayed alive long enough to catch the collapse. Those readings are priceless. Hunt's eyes lifted to mine. We also need a clear view of the constructs this phenomenon produced. We've captured one already near the perimeter. It's in the composite pen. You'll see it before you go. I nodded slowly. Do you have a recommendation yet on whether to continue operations at all? Fielding's tongue touched his cheek. We can't turn this off, Caleb. That makes certain choices for us. We can stand back, build a fence, and hope it never does anything worse. Or we can learn how it behaves. That's the path we've chosen. You tell us how to walk it without falling off. There it was, the polite version of what every client eventually asked. Tell us how close we can stand to the spinning blades without losing a hand, and please make the answer generous. Fine. Then let's start with your captured piece. The composite pen was a long, low shed of rough timber and heavy bolts. No mesh, no powered locks. Everything about it declared distrust of anything that needed current to work. Inside, the light was weak and dusty. Sun came through the gaps in narrow slats. The air held a hint of desert grit that never settled. 3 pens ran along one wall, framed in thick planks. Chains dangled from heavy hooks. Only one pen was occupied. The thing inside lay on the concrete near the back, chained to the far wall at 3 points. Whoever had done the job had misjudged its weight or its determination. The chains were drawn tight, hooks groaning. It had once been a small all-terrain cart, the kind crews used to move tools. What lay there now wouldn't roll anywhere. The main body was a swollen mass of fused metal, paint blistered into hardened bubbles. One wheel remained roughly where it should, bent inward on itself, spokes crushed together like folded fingers. The other wheels had been pulled apart and refashioned into jointed limbs, rims cut and stretched into curved feet. The chassis frame had kinked and twisted, then rebonded into arches that met in odd triads. Near the top, 3 camera lenses sat in a rough triangle, their housings sunk into the metal as if it had been poured around them. The glass was warped but mostly clear. They didn't move. Owen rested his hands on the fence. We caught this one just outside the zone. It was dragging itself back toward the bright stuff. Perimeter patrol spotted the gouge tracks and thought it was a wounded dog. Harlan stood a little back, arms folded. It didn't bark. "Does it move now?" I asked. "Slowly." Harlan watched the chains. Less when the column's quiet. More when we get a surge. We haven't seen it do anything that looks like thinking. Just trying to crawl home. I watched the bent limbs for any tremor. Nothing moved. "What happens if you turn it around?" Owen's mouth twisted. "We tried. Dragged it by the chains so the lenses faced the door as we left. Next day, it had twisted as much of itself as it could back toward the center. Like a plant bending toward the sun, only it has to tear parts of itself to move." He scratched at his stubble. "I don't like the way it uses bone either." "Bone?" He pointed near the base of the mass. Under a layer of scabbed metal, something pale curved in a clean arc. Not pipe, not plastic. Every field worker knew that texture. "From one of the casualties," Harlan murmured. "We found a few pieces missing. This one includes what looks like a shin. We've tagged it. We'll try to return it if anyone ever lets us do something that human with the remains." "What did you run into before you built this shed?" "Nothing fun." Owen's fingers curled around the wood. "First, we tried keeping a smaller piece in the main lab under more eyes. It started pulling nails from benches. Anything small and metal that wasn't fixed down. We lost a tool tray and a whole rack of hand drills before someone thought to weigh the damn thing." "So you moved it here?" He gestured around. "Wood, concrete, chains. Easy to see if anything goes missing. Easy to hear if it moves. When the column surges, you can hear them scraping sometimes, like a dog with 2 long nails on tile." Harlan's face tightened. "That's enough inspection. We go in this afternoon. The sooner you see the heart of it, the sooner you can write your rules." He turned toward the door. I stayed a moment longer, watching the lenses. It was easy to imagine someone on the other side of that glass, watching back. That was the trick of any camera. This one just made the imagination work harder. One of the chains creaked as the mass settled a few millimeters, metal stretching. The lenses stayed locked on some distant point only they could see. We rolled the cable train into position at dawn. In theory, a cable train is simple. A flat steel platform roughly the length of a pickup bed on wheels that ride low rails. The rails run from the perimeter line toward the facility ruins. Heavy steel cable threads through a pulley on the far end and back to a bank of winches outside the dead zone. Pull one side, the platform goes in. Pull the other, it comes back. No motors, no electronics, just steel, gravity, leverage. Owen and I hauled the empty train forward a few meters to test the feel. The rails clanked under our boots. Frost lingered in low hollows, thin and brittle. Harlan checked the clock rig bolted to the front of the platform. The metal box was about suitcase-sized, its lid held shut with wing nuts. Inside, brass gears and springs turned in slow choreography. "When do you wind it?" I asked. "Just before we go." He snapped the key a quarter turn, listening. "This one triggers the brake when we come back. If we pass the line and no one stops the train, the clock clamps the cable. That way we don't drag the whole rig into the winch pit." "And the other one?" I nodded at a second box near the rear. "That drops chalk markers at set distances, so we know where to look for samples on the way back if we're moving faster than we like." He tapped the box with 2 fingers, almost affectionate. A small group watched us from the perimeter. Fielding, arms tucked against the chill. Hunt in green, hands in pockets. Simon bleary but upright, notebook in hand. Fielding pitched his voice to Carrie. "Retrieve any mechanical recorders you can. Stay on the marked path. Don't touch the central structure. 3 hours." "It won't be 3. Harlan didn't look back. "We're in and out if we want to retire." Owen grinned. "Hear that, boss? Mott still assumes retirement's on the table." I rolled my shoulders under the harness. My gear was as analog as everything else. Coil of rope, hand tools, mechanical rangefinder, a battered film camera that had probably seen a war. "Let's go earn his pension," I muttered. We shoved the cable train up to the painted stakes. My skin prickled as soon as I stepped across. Not from static or any clean electrical bite. More like walking into a room where every device had been unplugged and your brain only noticed after a second. A subtle absence. Behind us, someone tested a radio again. It crackled, then fell silent as the antenna crossed the line. I didn't look back. The desert inside the dead zone looked the same as outside. Same tan dirt, same low plants clinging to life. The differences showed in the rubble. Dead cars lay at crooked angles along a cracked highway that cut through the zone, left where they'd coasted to a stop when the lights went out. Some doors hung open, evacuation abandoned halfway. Others had been pushed aside by later convoys. None had lights, alarms, or ticking hazards. They just sat. Farther in, a service truck rested nose down in a shallow ditch. Its windshield had blown outward. The metal around the hood rippled and bubbled, edges curled. Heat damage from no fire, I knew. The column on the horizon grew taller as we approached, but the flat land made judging distance a liar's game. The air around it shimmered. The day was already warming, and my brain kept trying to blame the mirage. The quiet worked on us. No birds, no insects. Our footsteps on the ties and the rattle of the train wheels filled the soundscape. Every few minutes Harlan checked his watch, a fat old thing with hands and a winding stem. "How far to the facility?" I asked. 8 miles. Rails take us most of the way. Then we walk." So we walked. We hit the first anomaly about halfway in. Owen spotted it. Right side, near that cracked slab. At first it looked like a tangle of scrap beside broken pavement. As we angled closer, detail sharpened. It had once been a delivery drone, the kind that hopped between outbuildings with small packages. Now its body was a knot of fused plastic and metal, smoothed in patches and knife-sharp in others. Its rotors had been pulled and stretched into jointed limbs ending in hooks. A length of rebar ran through its center as a crude spine. It lay on its side, one limb bent back under itself. Scorch marks radiated from where it rested, faint lines in the dust. "Has it moved recently?" I crouched, keeping distance. Owen studied the ground. "Scrapes say yes. Tracks point toward the core, then stop here. Maybe it ran out of whatever it uses." The lens that had been its forward camera sat on one side of the mass, pointed toward the column. Dust filmed the glass, but my reflection still warped back at me. "Orders say tag and retrieve anything that looks assembled." Harlan tilted his head, judging weight. "We drag it back on the return." "Chain it now," I said, "in case it wakes up." Owen nodded. "I'll handle it." He unhooked a length of chain from the train and stepped in. The links clinked over his gloves. Then one limb twitched. A hooked tip scraped the ground. Owen froze. The limb curled, searching for purchase. Another joined it, moving in a different rhythm. The mass shifted a finger's width toward the rails. "Back!" I snapped. Owen hopped clear. The broken drone didn't surge at us, didn't turn. It simply kept its clumsy crawl for a few seconds, then sagged, limbs sinking into dust. "That wasn't random cooling," Owen muttered. He wiped his hands on his pants, as if the sight alone left residue. "It moved the same direction everything else is moving. Back to the light." Harlan let out a breath, like he'd forgotten to breathe. "Chain it and go. Don't linger. It's done us the kindness of showing we still have time. Let's repay that by not wasting it." We looped the chain around protrusions that looked solid, dodging glass and anything that might be bone. Owen locked the shackles with a heavy hasp. When we tugged the free end, the mass came with us, scraping along on warped limbs. Every time the chain jolted, the thing twitched. Reflex or design, I couldn't tell. We dragged it onto the train, lashed it to one corner, and kept moving. The outer buildings of the flux facility rose from the desert like broken teeth. From a distance, it had been a clean cluster of concrete boxes and metal sheds around a central hall. The event had taken a bite out of that order. Roofs peeled, walls collapsed. A tower snapped halfway up and bent over at a shallow angle. Glass that faced the column directly had slumped in its frames, then frozen into waves. Railings near the heart of the blast had sagged towards the source, leaving icicles of solidified alloy hanging from their undersides. We stopped the cable train at what had been the loading dock. Someone had driven a ring of steel posts into the ground and run thick cable between them as a barrier. The posts sat just inside the dead zone. Beyond, the ruins waited. "This is where we leave the wheels." Harlan checked both clock rigs. "We anchor the train, then walk." He and Owen lashed the platform's front to two posts, looping cable and tying off with practiced pulls. I tightened my gloves and tried not to think about how many men had walked out of this same dock on the day of the event expecting to walk back in. The air grew hotter as we stepped onto facility ground, a steady climb that promised what lay ahead. The central reactor hall dominated the view. Its roof had been torn open near the center, a jagged ring of broken concrete and rebar framing the column's base. The white light shot upward, wider here than at a distance. It painted the interior in harsh contrasts. Heat distortion rippled up the length of the hall, blurring edges. Closer to the column, the floor had turned glassy and uneven, like ice midway through melting and freezing. "Watch your footing," I murmured. We moved along a safer path marked by charred stakes and painted arrows. Someone had already run an initial recon, at least far enough to mark where you could walk without sinking into something you didn't want to touch. Mechanical chart recorders sat in a recessed alcove on one side, behind a concrete lip. Old drum units, with paper spools and ink pens, the kind you only saw in museums and stubborn factories. Dust lay over them, but the cases looked intact. "There we go." Harlan almost smiled. "Old friends." He crouched at the first case. "Help me get them loose. Don't snap any levers. They're older than we are." Owen and I worked the mounting bolts with hand tools. Heat had warped the frames, but whoever installed them had been paranoid in the right ways. Redundant brackets, deep recess, thick concrete. As we unseated the first unit, I glanced toward the central pit. The column roared into the sky, though roar wasn't quite right. A constant low rush, like distant surf with a sharp hiss under it. The light hit my eyes like pressure, even in the corner of my vision. Around its base, the floor had sagged into a shallow bowl. Rubble that fell toward the column had either vanished or been flung back out as new forms. Those forms lay scattered around the pit. One pile looked like a cluster of folded beams pulled into a rough sphere, angles all wrong but intent clear. Gather mass. Another resembled a centipede made of conduit and cable. Body segments, individual loops of metal linked by fused clamps. Near the far wall, something taller loomed. It had been built from storage racks and structural braces. Racks bent into arcs and rejoined, forming a frame that suggested legs. Safety railing pieces had become a central spine, locked in place with melted fasteners. Camera housings studded the upper section, some pointed inward, others out. It stood half-formed, leaning against the wall like scaffolding abandoned mid-job. "You seeing this?" Owen followed my line of sight. "Yeah. Those joints repeat, same mount points, same patterns. The small things in the pen and on the train share pieces of this. It's building in modules." Owen's eyes stayed on the tall frame. "Like a kit. Only the kit is everything we ever dropped in there." Harlan lugged the first chart recorder out of the alcove. "If you want to debate philosophy with the machine, do it after we get the data. Right now we're standing under a hole in a hall that wants to peel itself up and feed itself to that light. Hands, please." We focused on the work. Freeing all the recorders took longer than I liked. My shoulders ached by the time we had them arrayed on a makeshift skid. Each unit had weight and teeth. The ink pens at their hearts sat frozen mid-swing, their last trace a jagged line. While we worked, the column flared once. Heat jumped. Constructs closest to the pit shuddered, as if a distant hand had tugged their strings. A shape dropped out of the light and smashed onto the far floor, spraying shards. Another followed, smaller, landing with a hollow ring. Owen flinched, then forced himself back to the bolts. "Let's move faster." We hitched harness straps to the skid and dragged it toward the dock. The weight fought us. The floor didn't help. Every second step slipped on glossy patches or cracked tile. We'd almost reached the door when something grabbed Owen's leg. He went down with a short bark of pain. The skid jerked sideways as his weight yanked the line. I spun. One of the constructs near the wall had lunged, if you could call it that when there was no muscle involved. It was a bundle of spars and beams fused around a twisted core. One limb, a length of rebar ending in a hooked plate, had snagged the strap around Owen's thigh. The limb contracted, dragging him toward the pit. "Hold!" Harlan snapped. I dropped the skid rope and dove for Owen. My boots skated on slick floor. I caught his harness with both hands, heels digging into a crack. The construct pulled again. Metal creaked. Other limbs twitched, searching for purchase. Up close, I saw part of its core wasn't metal. Something pale protruded from one side, ridged and curved. Vertebrae threaded onto a beam like beads on a skewer. The hook caught deeper in the strap. Owen twisted, trying to reach it, but the angle was wrong. "Don't cut the harness," I grunted. "You cut the strap. You go alone." "Love the options," he groaned. Harlan scrambled to the skid, fumbling for the pry bar we'd used earlier. He moved more on habit than speed, but got there. He grabbed the bar, stepped in, planted one boot near the construct's core, and jammed the bar between limb and floor. The limb fought him, metal shrieking. The hook bit deeper into webbing and grazed skin. Blood darkened the fabric. "Again!" I growled. Harlan put everything he had on the bar. The limb shifted. The hook tore free with a snap, taking a strip of strap with it. I dragged Owen backward. The construct lunged once more, overcommitted, and toppled sideways. Limbs flailed as it slid toward the pit. The floor had just enough slope and glass. It slid faster, sweeping rubble with it, then crossed an inner line. The column took it without ceremony. One instant it was there, scraping sparks. The next, gone. A smear of glowing residue boiled away in the glare. We lay there for 2 breaths, listening to our own noise and the steady rush of the column. Owen pushed up on his elbows, face tight. "Next time," he muttered, "I read the fine print on the job description." Harlan checked his leg. "Shallow. Strap took most of it. You'll have a scar to take home. If I live long enough to show it off." "Let's help with that," I cut in. "Recorders first. Then we drag one of these things out under controlled conditions and call it a day." We set to work again, this time with more urgency and fewer thoughts about what the tall frame might be trying to become. The trip back felt shorter and longer at once. The chart recorders sat lashed on the cable train, cases scuffed but intact. The captured roadside construct still occupied its corner, chain tight, lenses angled toward the heart of the facility. Near the perimeter posts, Harlan leaned over the front clock rig and flicked a lever. The brass gears inside clacked into a faster rhythm. Brake-armed. We pushed the train across the invisible line. My skin registered the transition again as absence lifting. Somewhere behind us, a generator rumbled to life in a nearby office. When the front wheels crossed a painted mark, the clock rig snapped its last tooth. A metal arm slammed down, biting the cable. The platform lurched, then held. "See?" Harlan breathed. "We don't need your new toys. Old ones still work." Crews swarmed the platform. Men eased the recorders free, passing them hand to hand toward a shielded trailer where Wells waited. Others eyed the chained construct with something between curiosity and fear. Wells moved like a man pulled in 2 directions. His gaze kept flicking between the recorders and the composite. The data won. He ran his fingers over the cases, checking seals, lips moving in quiet math. "We'll get these into the lab," he murmured. "If they caught even the first seconds of collapse, we'll finally see how the field changed. Maybe we can nudge it later." Hunt stood a few steps back, watching the construct. "That one moved when you picked it up. Toward the column." I stripped off my harness. "Like a crippled animal. Every piece we saw inside did the same." Always toward the core? Always. Fielding stepped up, hands on his hips. Preliminary assessment? I took a breath, glanced once toward the shed where the larger construct waited, then back at him. You don't have a random anomaly. I wiped grit from my palms. You have an assembler. The column takes anything that enters its field, strips it down, then throws parts back out arranged in patterns. Repeating joints, repeating connection points. It's building in modules and sending those modules toward itself like it's trying to finish something larger. Wells stiffened. Assembler implies intention. We have no evidence of consciousness. We're seeing emergent pattern formation driven by field geometry and available material. If you like that wording, use it in your papers. I met his eyes. On the floor, the difference doesn't matter. What matters is anything we send in becomes stock. Men, machines, structures. It doesn't separate them. Hunt's gaze weighed me. Do you recommend ceasing incursions? I recommend a halt until we know how stable the radius is and what happens when one of the larger designs completes. I pictured the tall frame leaning against concrete. I saw a partial body. If we give it enough parts to stand, we may not like what it reaches for. We can't stop entirely. We're under orders to keep gathering data. We can adjust procedures, increase margins. We can't walk away. That's the job, Harlan murmured at my side. You know that. Hunt stepped closer. Caleb, you've got a reputation. People listen when you write. You also know when a fight's unwinnable. If you refuse to endorse further activity, we replace you. If we replace you with someone who cares more about promotion than railside death, do you think that improves the odds? The words hit places I'd spent years armoring. Old images stirred. Another site. Another day. A safety checklist with one line I'd let slide because the client pushed and I needed the contract. A worker whose name still came to me uninvited. You're not subtle, I muttered. Clarity's faster. Hunt's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. This won't be buried. It's too big. The only question is who manages it. People like you who remember which end of a wrench cuts skin, or people who only understand it as a budget line. Fielding watched my face like it was another gauge. We'll act on your recommendations where we can. We'll give your concerns weight. But if you walk, I can't hold back what comes next. I can only try to aim it. Wells looked up from the recorders. The longer we wait to understand this, the more we live with blind risk. If the field ever shifts or the radius moves, not knowing how it behaves will kill more people than your caution ever saves. The three of them formed a triangle around me. Institutional need, military hunger, scientific obsession. I stood at the center in my goggles and scuffed boots, the man with the clipboard in their story, wearing a harness still streaked from someone else's near miss. I imagined saying no, writing the harshest report of my life, stapling my resignation on top, sending copies to every watchdog I knew. Hearings, leaks, some senator trying to turn all this into a party tool. More realistically, backroom briefings, sealed records, my name buried under non-disclosure clauses. None of that would stop anyone from feeding the machine. What I could do, maybe, was slow it. Thicken the padding between its teeth and the men they sent in. Not heroism. Habit. The same stubborn habit that had kept me alive this long. All right. I stay. On one condition. Fielding lifted his brows. We expand the pen area and rework the path to the hall. Fewer loose parts, more controlled structures. No scrap lying around for it to repurpose. And we start keeping an inventory of every piece of bone that comes back, fused into a contraption. Every single one. Fielding inclined his head. Agreed. Hunt studied me for a beat, then nodded once. Then let's get to work. They peeled off, each to their orbit. Men carried recorders into the trailer. Others approached the chained construct with hooks and ropes, ready to haul it to a new pen. I walked alone to the shed we'd visited that morning. Inside, the air had heated under the roof. Dust motes hung in slanted light. The large composite still sat chained at the back of its pen, limbs twisted at odd angles from its last attempt to turn. At some point between morning and now, it had moved again. The chains pulled at new angles. Scrapes marked the floor in fresh arcs. The welded mass had rotated as far as the restraints allowed. All three lenses faced the distant column, glass catching the faint glow that seeped through the gaps in the boards. By the time the desert baked hard enough to soften asphalt, the pen sheds had multiplied. The first one we built had been a rough thing, slapped together from whatever lumber the logistics guys could steal. Now there was a row of them, each a long wooden box with a number stenciled on and chains coiled neatly on hooks by the doors. Someone had painted a thin line on the ground between the sheds and the rest of the camp. Men stepped over that line without looking down, the way you automatically lift your foot over a threshold you've already tripped on. I stood outside Pen 3, listening to metal shift against metal on the other side of the boards. The constructs didn't make much noise, just the occasional scrape, the grind of steel on concrete, the rattle of chain when something inside tested its limits. If you spent enough mornings with your shoulder against the wall, you learned the difference between a random creak and deliberate effort. "You're loitering." Owen's voice came from behind me. I turned. He carried a clipboard, which would have been funny anywhere else. Out here, he used it to track what scrap the teams dragged in, where it came from, how much human material was mixed in. He called it the parts list. I tried not to. "You're the one writing love letters to scrap." He stepped up beside me, close enough that our shoulders almost brushed. "Pen 3's the new one from yesterday," he went on. "Big frame that tried to climb the fence." "I know." We both glanced at the inspection window, a small cutout filled with a welded grid, wide enough to slide a camera through if you trusted yourself that close. The thing inside filled most of the pen. It had grown around what used to be a pallet cart. The flat bed had become the core, thick with plates and cooled drips of metal. From that core, limbs reached in crooked arcs, joints made from hinge plates and what looked like sections of arm bone. The bone bothered me more now than it had at first. Early constructs had used mostly machine parts. As the months went on, more human pieces appeared. Long curves of femurs turned into braces, vertebrae stacked as pivots, fingers folded into hooks. Wells kept telling us this was just what you got when you fed a system mixed stock and let it run. It reused what it had. I believed that much. I didn't believe he was as detached as he pretended when he traced those shapes on his charts. A cluster of lenses studded the upper mass of the frame in Pen 3. Some cracked, some cloudy, some new. They pointed in different directions, but whenever the white column flared on the horizon, a slow ripple went through them, turning all the glass toward that light. "You sure you want to be in there when we feed it?" Owen asked. I watched the lenses shift, one after another. "The constructs in here are leashed," I answered. "The ones in the hall aren't." He snorted. "Comforting distinction." Footsteps approached on the packed dirt path. Hunt walked like the ground owed him a straight line. Even out here, in the heat, he wore the same green uniform. No visible rank, just that nameless patch and his growing tan. Wells trailed him, hair more unkempt than ever, eyes bloodshot. Fielding came behind them, sleeves rolled, clipboard in hand. The world had turned into a place where everyone tracked things on paper again. Hunt stopped an arm's length away. "Briefing in the assembly yard. Time to feed the god." He thought that was funny. I never could tell how much of it was nerves and how much was appetite. We crossed camp toward the yard. The assembly yard sat between the pen sheds and the rail lines. It had started as scraped ground where incoming scrap and outgoing constructs passed each other. Now it held tables, hoists, storage crates, and a row of heavy platforms where captured modules rested under tarps. Staff clustered there in a loose half-circle. Techs, a few security men, younger scientists with notebooks already out. Under a sunshade stretched between poles lay a row of thick steel crates, each marked with chalk, contents, mass, origin. Inside, packed in foam and padding, waited the excuse we leaned on. High-grade alloys, forged joints, ceramic bearings, shapes that in normal hands would become parts for aircraft, reactors, precision tools. In the assembler's field, they'd become whatever the pattern wanted. Wells climbed onto one of the crates so everyone could see him. "This is Test Series 10, he began. "Structured feed. We send in a curated kit of components and see what comes back when we control the quality and format of the input." Controlling input. Dream of every engineer and half the devils I'd worked for. "We've laid rails deeper into the facility. Cable trains will push these crates to a controlled distance from the central pit. Once they enter the inner zone, any electronics on or near them fail as usual. That's why every sensor on these kits is mechanical." He pointed toward a box sitting on a separate stand. It was the size of a portable generator, bolted to its own skid. Narrow drums sat slotted in its sides, each wrapped in gridded paper. Above each drum a stylus waited. "This rig's our eye. Purely mechanical recorders wound by spring. Each line tracks a different parameter we can derive from motion. Tension on the cable, speed of draw, vibration, temperature." He'd spent weeks tinkering with it, rebuilding an old piece of industrial history. When he worked on it, the circles under his eyes softened. It was the only thing in camp that made him look almost peaceful. "We mount this on the lead crate. The train pushes the kit in, drops it, and withdraws. Once the feed event's done, we recover the rig and read the drums. Observation teams outside the dead zone use scopes and film cameras to track any modules that emerge at the hall edges." Hunt folded his arms. "And we watch," he added, "to see how it builds when we give it what it needs. No crushed cars, no random scrap. Our parts, our shapes, our rules." He had to believe that last part. Fielding glanced over. "West, you'll be with the rail team. You know the path. You know how to spot when the floor's shifted." "I'll be on the observation ridge," Hunt put in. "If anything comes close to the perimeter, we adjust our posture." I watched the crate row. "What's the retrieval rule if the construct output moves toward the boundary faster than we expect?" "Then we trigger your brake system early," Fielding answered, "and cut the train if we have to. We don't drag anything from the inner hall straight back to camp." That brake system had been my first compromise. A purely mechanical clamp that could seize the cable when the clock rig told it to, even if half the winch crew froze. A safety net, I'd called it. They'd liked that. I eyed the sensor rig again, the neat rows of potential data. It would be easy to nudge something inside the mechanism. Easy to add one more step between trigger and brake. Easy to steal a little control. Hunt scanned the faces. "Any questions?" No one moved, or rather, they moved in ways that kept them out of his line of sight. "Good. Teams to positions. We start when the column stabilizes into low output." We broke apart. Owen fell into step beside me. "You've got that look." "Which one?" "The one you get when you're about to wrap more rope around a beam than it needs." We walked in silence for a dozen paces. "It tried to step out last week," I said. "Framework near the threshold." He grunted. "Yeah, I was there." I watched the arc reach a tool cart outside the line. Wrenches jumped. Every metal handle snapped in one motion. The only reason it didn't walk was because we didn't give it the rest of the pieces. Until now. We reached the rails. The cable trains waited with crates loaded. The sensor rig was bolted to the front of the lead crate and linked into the mechanical system that would tell it how fast the train moved and how much strain the cable took. I crouched and ran my fingers along the casing, feeling for the panel I'd installed. There, a small hatch secured with 2 screws. Maintenance access, everyone thought. It was. Just not the kind they expected. "Wind it," Harlan called from the far end of the platform. I opened the hatch. Inside, crammed along one side of the gears, nested a secondary mechanism, a slender bar that could translate a certain pattern of tension spikes into a trigger. That trigger didn't run to the brake clamp. It ran to a separate cable routed up to the old structural slab supports we'd left hanging over the inner hall. To anyone else, they looked like redundant bracing we'd never lowered. Once those supports dropped, thousands of kilos of concrete and steel would fall into the pit and onto anything between it and the outer wall. That included whatever the assembler built. It also included any men unlucky enough to be under that span. I checked the pins that held the release. No rust, no cracks. Still as functional as the day I convinced myself this was an extra line of defense and not a weapon. "West!" Harlan called again, sharper. I shut the hatch and pushed to my feet. "Coming!" We took our places on the platform, hands on the rails, boots braced. Harlan wound the clock rig with a crank. The spring inside coiled with a low grind. He watched the painted marks on the housing, then eased the crank back and locked it. Duration set. Once we hit the inner mark, we've got the time it takes this spring to unwind before it clamps the cable. That's our backstop. "Our first one," I muttered. He gave me a look and let it pass. We started pushing. Feeding runs felt different from retrievals. Bringing something out meant stepping backward, checking your six, staying alert for anything that wanted a free ride. Pushing crates in felt like walking a condemned man to the gallows and pretending he might still get a reprieve. The dead zones swallowed us again. I watched the perimeter structures shrink behind us, then focused forward. The rails hummed under the wheels. The crates creaked as their loads shifted with each bump. The column grew. As we neared the facility, the air warmed. Birds skirted the outer edge of the zone and wheeled away, never crossing it. I wondered how many generations it would take before their descendants treated that invisible wall like a cliff. The outer buildings looked worse than before. Time hadn't healed anything. More roofs dipped, more walls buckled. Constant low heat and stray surges had turned the complex into a slow-motion landslide. We guided the train into the loading dock and followed the marked path through the wreckage. Inside the main hall, the column owned the room. It roared up from the pit, broader now than on my first walk. The opening in the roof had widened, whether from the original blast or from pieces breaking away during surges. Around the pit, the floor had sagged deeper into a bowl. At the near side of that bowl, just inside the line we treated as "Do Not Cross," stood the framework we'd been watching grow. It towered over everything. The assembler had built it from heavy, load-bearing beams, gantry segments, chunks of reactor supports, and pieces of its own earlier modules. Legs stood on wide feet made from doubled plates and welded trusses. The central trunk bristled with sockets for future attachments. At its upper level, nests of lenses and reflective panels formed a kind of crown. If you saw it in a sketch, it would look like a person drawn by someone who'd only been told bodies had limbs and a head, not where they went. We lined the train with the drop point. Painted rail markers showed zones: outer edge we trusted, middle region, inner edge where matter had the highest chance of being grabbed. We pushed to the line we'd argued over back at camp, close enough to give the assembler a good look at our kit. Far enough, we told ourselves, that it wouldn't take us as part of the bargain. "All right, release clamps." We kicked the shoes off the train wheels, unlocked the restraints, and set wedges that would hold the train at the line until the clock rig's delayed pull engaged. Then we unhooked the lead cable from the train and clipped it to a ring on the front crate. Once we stepped back, tension from the winch crew outside would drag the crates into the pit. Owen patted the nearest steel wall. "Enjoy your little trip." A movement at the edge of my vision pulled my attention to the framework. It had shifted, just slightly. A change in weight, a settling of joints. Still, the fact it could move at all with no motors, no visible actuators, meant the assembler had learned to exploit the field itself. Forces in the air, pressure differences, little pushes our instruments barely knew how to catch. "You see that?" I murmured. Harlan followed my gaze. "We shouldn't be here when it makes any bigger moves." We backed to the marked safe line and gave the hand signal toward nothing. Somewhere beyond the dead zone, over the rise, a winch crew watched through binoculars. The cable twitched. The lead crate lurched forward, wheels squealing. We watched it roll into the bowl, sensor rig clamped to its front, paper drums already turning as springs unwound. The second and third crates followed, their mass making the platform shake. At the edge of the inner zone, the crate hit a patch where the floor had melted and refrozen. It dipped, shuddered, then slid on, picking up a little speed. When the front of the first crate crossed an invisible line, everything electrical on it died. The sensor rig was safe. The little emergency beacon we'd bolted on as a comfort charm wasn't. Its light cut off like someone had flipped a knife switch. The column reached. It didn't lean or bend. It birthed a dozen thin strands of brighter light around its base. Those threads snapped towards the crate like steel cables jerked by hidden winches. They touched the metal and sank in without scorching, vanishing as if they'd always belonged there. The crate unraveled. Not explosively. Joints relaxed, welds softened, bolts driven into mounting plates dripped downward, then froze mid-flow. The box's structure came loose and rose into the air, pieces held aloft by forces we barely understood. More strands licked out, touching the other crates. Soon the air above the pit crawled with fragments, plates, bars, bearings, rods. They spun and bumped and stuck, like someone shaking a box of magnets over a table of filings. Chaos at first, then sudden clumps. Within minutes, shapes began to form. Not the small sphere modules I'd seen early on, larger pieces, built to slot into other things. One grew into a long limb assembly, its core a beam reinforced with braced triangles like an old radio tower. Joints at regular intervals formed from paired plates and sandwiched bearings. Another coalesced into a squat cylinder studded with anchors to receive those limbs. Thicker rods inside suggested load paths that could carry weight. Above them, lighter structures formed, panels, cages, optics clusters. The assembler wasn't improvising. It had a plan. The modules fell, not randomly. They were aimed. Limbs landed near the framework at the pit edge. The cylinder crashed down near the column. Smaller parts hit in a ring around them. The framework woke. Joints that had seemed fixed revealed hidden play. Segments slid. Beams telescoped. The whole structure leaned down, reaching for new parts with crude hooks and clamps. It began to assemble itself. Watching any machine self-assemble is unnerving, even when humans designed it. Watching one that learned the move on its own made my ribs feel tight. The cylinder rolled closer to the column, driven by slope and unseen pushes from the field. Limbs reached from the framework, snagged it, hauled it up. Brackets locked with sharp nocks. Bearings slotted into sockets. The framework grew. Within half an hour, it had added enough modules to extend two major limbs far beyond their original reach. One limb reached toward the roof. The other angled outward, probing toward the dead zone boundary. Harlan wiped sweat off his forehead with his wrist. "We should pull back. Father, that thing's hunting for leverage." We retreated along the path, eyes on the hall. From higher up the rubble slope, I could see the framework testing its world. It shifted weight from foot to foot, if you could call them feet. Plates flexed, joints rotated. Panels at the top angled lenses toward different parts of the environment. One long limb extended toward a rusted tool cart just beyond the painted safe line. The cart had been abandoned after a previous team's nerves broke. The limb didn't touch it. It hovered. Tiny bolts on the cart jumped. Wrenches shifted in their tray. A tape measure snapped back into its case. Every loose bit of metal jerked toward the limb, then settled. For a moment, faint blue traces spiderwebbed between limb and metal. "Field bleed," Harlan muttered, outside the known radius. The limb drew back. The traces vanished. We watched as the framework slowly rotated, crowning lenses first toward the column, then the distant perimeter. On the ridge behind us, a flare popped white against the sky. The winch crew's signal. Time to leave. We hauled back to the loading dock where the train waited. The cable, now empty of crates, lay slack. The clock spring was nearly unwound. We reset it, rigged the return harness, and began the long march back, watching over our shoulders. The framework didn't follow. The first meeting after a test always smelled like dust and dried sweat. We crammed into the small briefing room with real walls instead of canvas. Charts and photos covered every surface. Film strips curled on the table, still drying. The analog smell of a world that had forgotten pixels and remembered ink. Wells had already unrolled the sensor drums. He stood at the front with one clipped to a board, finger tracing a dark curve. A lantern burned on a shelf behind him for light. No one trusted the grid enough to wire this room directly anymore. The tension curve here shows when the crates cross the inner zone. Change in drag as the field takes hold. This snap is when the casing starts to unravel. After that, constant force. I watched the ink. What's this section? I tapped a later segment where the line rose and dipped. Wells frowned and leaned in. That's unexpected. It looks like a periodic increase in pull followed by a sharp drop, like something tugging on the cable from inside, then letting go. Something, I repeated. He straightened. The construct, perhaps, adjusting its weight against anchor points. Hunt lounged in the back, one boot hooked over his knee. It's testing the leash. Wells stiffened. The field exploits whatever paths it can, he answered. It isn't a dog. It isn't trying to escape. It's following the form we provided. We didn't provide it those bones, I cut in. Harlan shifted in the corner with his own stack of notes. Regardless of framing, he said, we've got two facts. 1. The outer limb reached beyond the measured radius. 2. The sensor picked up matching tension changes. That means the effective boundary can flex. Fielding rubbed his temples. Are we talking inches, feet, miles? In that test, probably meters, Wells replied. But magnitude isn't the problem. The problem is that any fluctuation exists. The dead zone's not a perfect circle etched into the ground. It's a dynamic field that can bulge under certain conditions. And if it can bulge, I said, it can grow. Silence followed. Hunt broke it. The outer perimeter hasn't moved in any measurable way since the event. Our instruments outside that line show no change. The only movement we see is inside, where the field interacts with what we feed it. That's manageable. Until it isn't. Fielding shifted his weight. What exactly are you recommending? Throw a tarp over the project, lock the base, walk away, hope it never does more than this? It would have been easy to say yes. Pointless, but easy. You've seen this in the data before, I said. Wells's gaze snapped up. Excuse me. In the early charts, the ones Mott filed that you marked as noise, minor shifts at the radius, not enough to ring alarms, enough to notice if you were watching for stability. You flagged them, then you buried them. Harlan's eyebrows climbed. The initial recordings were messy, Wells answered. Equipment not designed for this. Temperature swings, mechanical drift, operator error. I cut data that didn't meet the standard for clear interpretation. Or data that made it impossible to argue the zone was fixed. Our eyes locked. He looked away first. That told me enough. Hunt uncrossed his legs. West, you're not wrong about the risk, he said. But you're not wrong about something else either. This project won't vanish because you write a strong recommendation. It'll move, with fewer breaks. So what do you recommend? I stared at the drums, at wavy lines that felt like they should spell out a story I didn't want. We treat it like a machine learning process, I said. Not software. Older sense. A line that keeps doing what it's tooled to do until you change it. Every time we feed it better parts, it builds better modules. Every time it builds better modules, it gains more ways to stress the boundary. We prepare for it trying to step outside as the default case, not a theory. Fielding pinched the bridge of his nose. With what? We can't bomb the site. We can't drill under it. We can't smother that column. We can drop the building on its head if it rises high enough. Hunt's eyes narrowed. Explain. In the hall, there are still shielding slabs hanging in the superstructure. Removable blocks they used during reactor construction. We never lowered all of them. Some sit on shelf beams above the pit held by mechanical catches. We rig those catches to a mechanical trigger we control from inside. Wells leaned back. You're talking about burying the central structure under rubble, like a mine accident. You have no idea if that would do more than inconvenience it. I don't, but it's mass we control. If the framework near the boundary grows enough to move outside, we trip the catch, break its legs, take away whatever reach it gains. And whoever is in the hall when thousands of kilos drop, Hunt asked, what happens to them? They die. Instead of the people outside the zone who'll never see it coming if we let that thing walk. There it was, stripped bare, death here or death there. Men with faces I knew, or civilians whose names I'd never hear. Fielding stared at the drum. Draw it up. Design the trigger. Make it hard to trip by accident. We'll review it. He wanted to keep his choices abstract. He wouldn't be the one pulling anything. After the meeting broke, I caught Harlan in the hall. You kept the early charts. The ones Wells cut. You're too old to throw data away, he snorted. I keep everything. Come by my room after dinner. I'll show you how little I trust the official archive. His room was somehow smaller than mine. A narrow bed, a small table, shelves built from pallets and brackets. Every inch of wall held boxes of paper, neatly labelled. A stack of old metal cases sat in one corner. He pulled down a box and flipped the lid. Inside, chart strips lay rolled and bound with twine, each with a date and time on its tail in his cramped hand. These are the first 3 days, he said, before the big minds decided what mattered. He unrolled one across the table. The ink line wobbled, little spikes and dips. Field radius measurement, he went on. Mechanical indicator on the old service road. Swinging arm calibrated to deflection. Every time the field shifted, arm moved, pen tracked it. The line showed a mostly steady baseline, then a sharp bump. This is the event, he said. Big spike, then it settled. After that, fluctuations. Small, but there. He unrolled another strip, another bump. Not enough to alarm anyone who wanted comforting numbers. Enough to make him tuck them away instead of feeding them to the burn barrel. You tried to raise this, I guessed. He shrugged. I brought it to Wells. He promised to account for it in the models. Later I saw those points missing in the summaries. When I asked, he called them sensor error. He met my eyes. I don't trust error that always points the same way. You didn't push. I'm a retired comms man who came back to play with his old toys. He's the lead with a doctorate and half of Washington in his address book. You know how that balance works. He was right. Same story on rigs, refineries. Everywhere good intentions met deadlines. People like him carried the weight of knowing. People like Wells carried the power to ignore them. I left with copies of a few strips folded into my pocket. Their small wobbles felt heavier than they looked. That night, I lay awake listening to the distant rush of the column and faint clinks from the pen sheds. Somewhere in the maze between me and the dead zone, bone and metal scraped toward a light they couldn't see. By morning, I'd convinced myself the crush trigger wasn't just a gamble, it was necessary. Setting up the failsafe took weeks. We sold it as reinforcement. The slabs sat in recessed pockets above the main hall, stacked on steel supports that jutted from the remaining superstructure. During construction, they'd shielded the core. Thick blocks of dense material lined with steel and anything else that blunted radiation. After the event, some had fallen. Others stayed lodged up there, held by old pins tied to nothing. We could have pulled them. No one pushed. Lazy luck. I crawled through service passages above the hall with a harness and coil of cable, counting slabs, measuring weight distribution, checking how much beam metal had been eaten by heat. Owen came along to make sure I didn't kill myself before we even tested the system. You ever notice how every big disaster leaves leftovers that feel like they're waiting for the next one? He asked as we inched along a ledge. Trying not to. We reached the first slab. Up close it looked less like shielding and more like a tombstone. Pitted surface, chipped edges, but the bulk was there. Chains that once held it lifted lay slack. The beam under it had sagged toward the pit. I ran a gloved hand along the old catch. "Wouldn't take much," I murmured. "Pull the pin, beam flexes, slab slides. Gravity does the rest." "Assuming the beam lasts," Owen said. "Assuming the slab doesn't jam halfway. We'll add wedges, guide plates, whatever helps it fall clean. We've got more steel than we know what to do with." By the time we finished, each slab had a cable running to a central junction. From there, a single line led down into the control pit near the hall entrance. That line connected to the secondary mechanism in the sensor rig. If the field tugged the cable above a threshold in the pattern we expected, a sustained pull toward the outer boundary, a real attempt to step out, the mechanism would trigger. The line would yank, catches would withdraw, slabs would drop. We tested the linkage with small weights outside the zone. On a mocked-up beam, we built a scale catch, ran the line through the same path, used a spare clock rig to simulate delay. When the trigger tripped, the pin slid clean. The weight dropped. Hunt watched one test, arms folded. "If this trips with men in the hall," he said quietly, "who's responsible?" I didn't look at him. "The man who pulls too many people in there. The man who built what needs dropping. The man who wired it. All of us. Take your pick." He paused. "Will you be in the pit when it trips?" "If I can." We both knew the trigger didn't need me standing over it. It would fire when the pattern matched, whether or not my hands were on it. There were ways to override, to delay. I kept those close. We didn't talk about the technicians assigned to the pit. They were there because someone had to maintain manual systems and babysit rigs on tests. In any plan built for control, there were always people whose job was to stand next to the dangerous parts and pretend their presence mattered. They mattered plenty, just not to the people who'd write the briefings later. The surge came 2 tests later. We'd fallen into a rhythm: feed, watch, retrieve, analyze, argue. The framework at the pit's edge grew with each run, adding bracing, plates, lens clusters. It didn't try to step beyond the boundary again. It had time. The day the sky shifted, I woke to the perimeter bell hammering a pattern we'd agreed would mean one thing. The column was behaving outside usual limits. I shoved on my boots and ran. Men spilled out of barracks and offices, some half-dressed, some already buckling on harnesses. The air felt hotter even this far from the line. Heat ripples danced over the desert. At the observation ridge, scopes already sprouted from tripods. Hunt stood behind one, fingers flicking the focus. The column's flaring, widths up, height seems the same. Construct activity at the pit, no movement toward the outer perimeter yet. He stepped aside so I could look. Through the scope, the hall looked like a kiln. The column's base had thickened, outer bands brighter. The bowl around the pit glowed at the edges, tiny streams of molten material running down. The framework stood with legs braced wide, limbs spread like a crane in a storm. Smaller constructs clambered over its lower frame, slotting themselves into openings, disappearing into the mass. It was consuming its own children. "Where's the pit crew?" I asked. "Gear prep. Pit's manned. They were securing the manual clamps when the flare started." I watched the base. As more modules latched on, its mass shifted higher. The crown level gained new angled panels that looked built to deflect heat. Lenses multiplied. Upper limbs thickened. "What's it doing?" "Building a spine," Hunt replied. "Weight wants a path." A gust of hot wind hit us, flinging dust that stung my eyes. Below, the framework sank lower, bending its legs, then began to push. It didn't go straight up. It leaned, like it had learned from last time. Outer limbs dug into floor inside the bowl, anchoring. Opposing limbs extended toward the wall at the inner boundary. Concrete cracked. The floor under its feet buckled. A long fracture opened on the far side of the pit, running towards the hall's wall. "The radius line," I breathed. "They're testing it." At the fracture's far end, a chunk of floor near a buried cable tray gave way. Rubble puffed up. The framework shifted, limbs probing. I didn't wait for the next move. "I'm going to the pit." Hunt caught my arm. "You yanked that trigger with men in there. You own those bodies." "If I don't and that thing walks, we all own what happens next." Our eyes met. He let go. "Go. I'll call for evacuation. If they listen, you'll have less blood on your hands." Closest thing to kindness I'd heard from him. The path to the hall had never felt longer. I jumped into a stripped truck and took it to the line, then abandoned it and ran along the rails. Heat hit like stepping into an oven. Sweat soaked my shirt and vanished just as fast. Inside the facility grounds, rubble had shifted. Slabs that had rested slid in slow, grinding motions, drawn by bad slopes and subtle changes in the field. Metal structures groaned. Dust fell. I forced myself to slow enough to pick my footing. Breaking my neck short of the pit would have been a bad joke. At the hall entrance, 3 men held the control pit. The pit was a recessed area by the door, lined with mechanical controls for cable clamps, brake rig, and now the crush trigger. Lever arrays and gear housings covered the walls. It had been a backup station for the reactor's mechanical systems. Now it was the nerve center of our analog experiments. Jared stood by the main brake levers, knuckles white. "You're not supposed to be here," he called up. "We've got orders to hold till we get an all clear from the ridge." He followed procedures like religion. One reason I'd put him there. I trusted him not to improvise at the wrong time. "I'm your all clear today." I dropped into the pit beside him. "Where's the override line for the crush trigger?" He frowned. "It's wired through the new rig. You know that. You wrote the specs." "Show me." He hesitated, then pointed to a thick cable running along the wall, through a pulley into a gear housing. "That tells the catches to release when the pattern matches. We can cut it if we have to. That's the final override." The other 2 techs, younger, watched with wide eyes. "What's happening out there?" one asked. "Nothing you need to see." I grabbed a scope on a swivel at the pit's edge and swung it toward the pit. Through it, the framework filled half the view. It had grown even in the time it took me to reach the hall. New modules clung to it. Upper levels held arches that looked like ribs. Between them, panels shifted, angling against the column's heat. The base had pushed farther, 1 foot planted over the crack that now ran all the way to the wall and up into the structure. "Field bleed," I muttered. The column flared. Every lens on the framework turned in unison, first toward the column, then toward the door. Toward us. Upper limbs extended. Their tips crossed the line we'd marked as safe. A tool chest by the door burst open. Its latch tore free. The lid flew up. Every tool inside jumped and slammed into the limb. Hammers, wrenches, screwdrivers, sockets. They stuck wherever they hit, half buried in plates that had softened just enough. Sparks danced along the limb where it crossed into normal space. The dead zone wasn't holding the border anymore. The border was trying to hold the dead zone. "Jared, we may have to drop the slabs." His grip tightened. "There are men in here." "Yes. Orders are to hold. Orders are written by men who aren't here. Look." I stepped aside so he could use the scope. He stared for 3 breaths, then shut his eyes. "You think this place will fall on them quick?" he whispered. "Yes," I lied. "Quick enough." One of the younger techs glanced at the cable. "Should we get out?" Part of me wanted to say yes. Tell them to run, to be halfway to the perimeter before anything dropped. The colder part knew that if the pit emptied now, we'd lose control of the clamps and any chance at a coordinated response. The override line needed hands nearby if we had to cut it at the last possible second. If we all ran, we were trusting everything to a machine with no sense of timing. "You hold. If I tell you to cut that line, you cut it. If I tell you to drop, you drop. If the hall starts to come down on its own, you run and you don't wait for me." They nodded. I pulled the scope back. The framework had found a rhythm. It rocked forward, pushing against the floor, then settled, then rocked again. Each time the crack widened. Chunks of concrete broke free and slid toward the pit. The field seemed to ride the movement, probing new paths. Upper limbs reached farther. Heat at the door climbed, a wave that made my eyes water. "I'm triggering it." Jared flinched. "Not yet. They're calling for evacuation. If we get another minute." "We don't. Look at that reach. If it gets one solid anchor outside the zone, we lose control of where it falls." He stared at the cable. "You pull that now," he whispered. "You kill us." "Not necessarily." Lies were coming easier. Truth was, I didn't know how the slabs would fall, which way beams would break, how mass would shift. I'd run the scenarios my brain could hold. Reality loved breaking models when it mattered. I grabbed the manual override lever, a simple steel bar, pull it, and the secondary mechanism inside the rig triggered even if the pattern didn't match perfectly. I'd insisted on installing it, for emergencies. My hand closed on the grip. I thought of the towns outside the zone, people on the ring around the circle, adjusting to blackouts and rerouted lines, kids who probably watched the artificial sun on clear nights the way my neighborhood had watched storms. If that framework stepped out, the story wouldn't end here. I pulled. The lever resisted, then moved with a hard clank that ran through the pit and into the walls, along the cable into the gears. Somewhere above, pins withdrew. I felt the change before I heard it. A deep vibration shuddered through the hall as the first slab shifted. Dust rained. The framework paused mid-motion, like the assembler sensed a change in the load paths it had been using. Then gravity finished. Slabs fell from the far side inward. The first dropped onto open bowl, smashing scattered modules. Rubble blew outward. The second hit closer to the base, slamming into an anchored limb. The limb snapped, the whole structure listing. I grabbed the nearest tech and shoved him down. The third slab came free and fell near the column itself, cutting through the limb that had stretched toward the door. The limb sheared in a burst of sparks and molten metal. The section near the border dropped, twitching, then went still. The framework tried to recover. It shifted weight to remaining supports, other limbs snatching for anchors. Each move broke more beams. The final slabs dropped almost together. One struck the core directly, punching through the trunk. The impact bent the entire structure, forcing its upper body to cantilever over the pit. The last slab landed on that bent section, driving it down into the bowl. The sound was like a building collapsing. Mass slammed into mass, beams screamed, chains snapped. The column flared brighter for a jagged instant, then settled back, as if it had coughed. Chunks of concrete and steel whirled through the air. One struck the lip of the control pit and shattered, filling it with shards. Another glanced off the outer wall and spun away. Dust swept over us. I curled over the tech I'd pushed down, arms over my head. Something hard hit my shoulder, glanced off, tore skin through my shirt. When the worst impact stopped, I raised my head. Dust rolled across the floor in shifting curtains, hiding and revealing glimpses of what we'd just made. The framework lay pinned under a chaotic pile of slabs and twisted beams. Parts still moved, weak spasms from modules trapped at bad angles. The column roared around the edges of the rubble, its base partly blocked but not extinguished. The pit crew had survived. No direct hits had landed in the recess. The walls had taken glancing blows, leaving gouges but no breaches. We'd gotten lucky. I almost believed it until I saw one of the three men wasn't moving. The tech I hadn't grabbed lay on his side by the far levers. A shard of concrete the size of my forearm had caught him at the base of the skull. His body blocked part of the panel. Blood pooled under his head. Jared crawled toward him on hands and knees, reached for his neck, then stopped short. Bradley. The name came out flat. Shock trying and failing to wrap reality. "Don't move him," I said. "We'll get help." There was no help. Not for him. The other tech stared at the wall. "You told us to stay. If we'd run, he'd be alive. If you'd run, you'd be under that." I nodded toward the slabs. One had landed partly across the area where we'd stood minutes before, crushing two old consoles. Both things were true. Both would sit with him, and with me, as long as this story did. A new sound crept into the hall, scraping. Under the slabs between beams, something moved. The framework wasn't dead, it couldn't rise. Too many supports were broken. But pieces still tried. Limbs twitched, panels flexed, lenses in the half-buried crown angled as far as they could toward the column. The assembler was already working on the next version. "Evacuation," I snapped. "Now, we've done what we can." We climbed out of the pit and stumbled toward the door. Outside, the air felt almost cool. Men ran along the paths, some toward us, some away. An ambulance team shoved a wheeled stretcher along the cracked pavement. Behind us, the column kept roaring. Slabs at its base glowed where it touched them. The pile wouldn't hold forever. It didn't need to. It only had to buy time. I tried not to think about the name Jared had spoken. Bradley. One more entry on the parts list, whether we liked it or not. Weeks later, the world had settled into a new shape. The official story framed the slab drop as a triumphant response to an unexpected surge. Field event successfully mitigated by on-site personnel. Loss of one technician during heroic containment action. My name sat in the middle as the man who designed and executed the failsafe. I got a commendation from someone in Washington whose name meant nothing to me. Hunt brought it in a plain envelope, handed it over with a half-amused look, and left before I could find words for whatever sat between gratitude and disgust. Wells buried himself in the new data. The drums from the rig had survived. They showed the moment the framework tried to push out, the spike in tension, the flare in field intensity. They also showed the timing of the slab drops. "We proved we can alter the configuration," he told me in one of our short, brittle conversations. "We imposed a new boundary condition. That matters. You proved it can survive a building falling on it. That matters more." Fielding started using different language in briefings. The artificial sun stopped being a disaster and became an anomaly under active management. The constructs were field-induced composite artifacts. The dead zone became a strategic research exclusion area. New fences went up farther out. Tents gave way to buildings. Rumors spread of a new program name, something longer than Flux, something with applications in it. I did my job. I wrote reports on every construct that crawled out of the hall. Every shift in field readings Harlan wrung from his aging instruments. I flagged risks. I recommended mitigations. Sometimes, they even happened. On good days, I could pretend it was enough. On bad days, I remembered Bradley's body in the pit and the way the framework had reached through our neat paint lines like they were decorations, not boundaries. The day the crate arrived, the sky over the base had the hazy look it got after a minor flare. Men moved like people who'd learned to work under a constant low-grade threat. I'd finished reviewing incident reports and found myself wandering toward the pen sheds without quite deciding to. An intern intercepted me halfway, breathless. "There's a new arrival from Inner Zone Storage," he blurted. "They want you to log it." "What is it?" He lifted his hands. "A big one. Bigger than the others. Some of the guys didn't want to move it without you signing off." He led me to a side building I rarely visited. The composite storage shed sat apart from the main pen row. It held modules that didn't fit well in the standard pens. Too large, too awkward, too disturbing. The new crate stood alone, taking up a third of the floor. Thick planks banded with steel, a number stenciled on the side, and the word holding under it. The lid had multiple latches, each with a spot for a padlock. Only one lock hung there, a simple brass one stolen from some other duty. Its key dangled from a nail on the wall. "Where'd it come from?" "Recovery team from the hall," the intern answered. "They went in after the slab settled, found it near the base of the pile, half buried. They think it grew after the drop." I stepped closer. Vents cut into the crate's sides, narrow slots under heavy mesh, enough to vent heat if something inside got hot, enough to let sound through. Nothing reached me. "You open it," I told him. "If it moves, you close it." He blinked. "I thought, you're the inspector." "I am. I inspect. You unlatch and stand by to slam." "Deal." He took the key, moved to the lock. It clicked open with cheap finality. He flipped the latches, metal tongues snapping back. The lid creaked as he pushed it. Sandbags padded the inside to keep the contents from shifting. Some had split. Sand spilled around the base of the object in the center. It stood upright, braced by blocks. The construct was about man height. The core was welded beams framing a rough torso. Plates overlapped across them like improvised armor. Between the plates, ribs showed unmistakably human, their ends sunk into metal. Chains ran through eyes formed by vertebrae stacked along the spine. Where a head might have been, the assembler had built a compact housing packed with lenses. Not just 3 or 4, dozens. Some from cameras I recognized, others from instruments that were never meant to go near the core. Set at different depths, pointing in slightly different directions, overlapping. Shed lantern light struck them and fractured into tiny reflections. 2 limbs hung from the upper frame. Not arms, not really. Each was a cluster of jointed spars and pivoting tools. I recognized a wrench welded sideways in one assembly, the curve of bone in another. The lower section ended in stumps where legs might have grown. Instead, a cluster of small modules clung there, shaped like wheels that had half melted together. A boot sole stuck out from one side, tread intact, leather fused into metal. Next to it, something caught my eye. A name tag, bent and warped but readable, white letters on black. Bradley. The intern shifted. "You want me to close it?" The construct didn't lunge. It didn't rattle chains or scrape the crate walls. It just stood, braced by sandbags held upright by its own geometry. As we watched, the lenses twitched, barely, a fraction of a turn, enough to reorient a few toward the shed door, toward me. I stepped closer until I could see my own outline fractured across a dozen tiny circles. A man broken into pieces, each under a different glass. For a second I almost called for Wells, for Hunt, for Fielding, for anyone who could turn this into a committee entry. Instead, I reached for the lid. "Don't log this yet," I told the intern. "It goes in the queue for later study." He frowned. "What do I write?" "Routine composite, non-urgent, store and secure." "You sure?" "It has human parts. We've got dozens that do. This one can wait." I swung the lid down. The last thing I saw before it closed was the lenses adjusting a fraction more, chasing the narrow slice of sky above. The lid met the frame with a wooden thud. I slid the latches, pushed them until they seated, and snapped the brass lock shut. The key felt small between my fingers as I hung it back on its nail. Then I turned and walked out of the shed.